Welcome to today's tutorial. It's almost Halloween. Or maybe when I'm uploading this it will be Halloween. But today it's gonna be a little darker than usual. And yeah, let's roll the intro. Hey, what's up? It's Hemstad here. Doing another tutorial today. We're going to be adding motion to a still photograph. I'll be using Photoshop and After Effects to do that, and adding more so than just like parallax, but adding like more dynamic motion and perspective shifting to a photograph. So how we're going to achieve that is by using a depth map. And so we're going to take our still photograph, separate out the layers, and then create depth maps for each of those layers. So let's jump into that. Alright, so we're over in Photoshop. For this photograph I took a plate and then added my subject in, took the subject, and so I had two separate layers, and then I just used the pen tool to cut it out and create my mask. If you were doing this from a flat photograph, you would simply cut out your subject and then clone stamp and add everything that needs to go in the background back in. But if you're planning on doing a motion photograph, it helps to have what's called a plate, which is just a blank background to add things to. So here we have our background layer and our subject. Here is actually pre-made depth map that I've already done. This is what we're going to be making. Let's go ahead and close that, and let's go ahead and make two new layers. And we'll go ahead and select the pixels of our subject. We'll expand that selection by 8 pixels, or 10 pixels, yeah. Well, yeah, 10 pixels. We'll do 10 pixels. Why not? So then we want to go ahead and create a mask for that layer, for our top layer, and that's going to be our subjects. So we can go ahead and rename that just so we know what's what. And so we just create a layer mask on there, so that's going to make our job easier. Let's start by doing the depth map for the background in particular. So go ahead and turn off our subject layer so we just have our background there. So for the depth pass on this, we're going to be using a combination of selections and the gradient tool, especially when you have something planar like this, by selecting the planes in the actual layer. But we're going to have to start by filling our entire layer with neutral gray. It's 50% gray. In the plugin we're going to be using After Effects, which is Displacement Map. 0 produces negative displacement versus halfway, 50% gray, or 128 produces no displacement. So the gray is no displacement. That's where we want to start our depth, and then we can just add to this gray to create the rest of our depth map. So we're going to set our mode to linear dodge, which is add. So it'll actually just add, so you won't get any values that are less than the neutral gray. And we'll set our background to 50, or our foreground to 50, and our background should be 0, which is black. So when we're making our gradient, we'll only be ever adding up to white. That makes sense, because 50% plus 50% is 100%, which is white. Go ahead and make a selection on the first plane wall here. We'll start here on the left, and we'll go ahead and add a gradient to that. So we'll select a gradient tool, standard linear gradient. So going from lightest to darkest there. And then we'll go ahead and select our next plane, the other wall. Kind of try to line it up there. Sometimes it's a little hard to see. Just get it rough. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Of course, the more accurate it is, the better the displacement will be. Okay, let's go ahead and do the bottom layer here. You don't want to overlap where other ones are, because remember we're adding. So if we add to those will also turn white, which would make them further in the foreground. Those corners would be farther away from the camera. And we'll go ahead and blur that corner after we fill this in. Now we'll do the ceiling. Pretty straightforward. Once again, we'll probably need a lot of space. We may want to adjust the opacity on this one just because it's going to be more difficult. and the ceiling is rather far away. So we don't want to add too much away from the background because it's pretty close to the background. And you should kind of try to line up with the gradients on the wall. Everything that's roughly the same distance should have the same gray, the same tone, the same lightness. All right, let's zoom it in. So yep, that's 100 opacity. So we're gonna try to clean up those edges. Everything else looks pretty good. Go ahead and clean these up, blur them out a little bit. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. It's actually named after a dude. His name was Gauss, hence Gaussian blur. Okay, now we're gonna add some detail back into this map because we have like our light fixtures and that sort of thing. So we're gonna copy that up to the top, Alt-click and drag the layer to duplicate it. Make sure it's above your depth map and change that to linear dodge add. And you see it's overlaid itself, but it's made everything much too bright. First we'll desaturate it. Adjustments, desaturate. Also as a note, I'm doing this in 16-bit. Can't really tell on the screen recording because it's been compressed, but the gradients look smoother because it's in 16-bit versus this is compressed into something. The more bits, the smoother, but the bigger the file size, slower the processing. Go ahead, after desaturating it, just go ahead and drop the opacity down to like 4%. And that'll add a little bit of that detail back in. So we'll go ahead and merge that into our depth layer. So make them one thing, so merge layers. So now we're gonna go ahead and add one more level of detail because notice there's some stuff that isn't light, like that piping back there, it's actually dark, so it's not adding anything to the depth map. So we're actually gonna go in and select those things and then add a little bit of more depth. So in the photograph, those things maintain a little bit of their depth. It's that subtle, because that subtle difference actually does make a lot of difference in making the motion of everything convincing. So go ahead and just outline, select this. I've had my selection on feathered about 10 most of this time, just to, because it doesn't have to be exact, and if the stuff doesn't blend, it kind of creates like these abrupt cuts in the distortion of the image, so you always kind of want it blended when you're doing this. You can always add some blur after the fact too to remove any hard edges. Then you go ahead and just adjust the brightness. Paintbrush, and just to add, and since we don't want to add very much, we'll go ahead and set the black level down to something like 1 or 2%. Set the paintbrush to linear dodge add. That looks good for the depth for the background. Now we got to do depth for our subject. So let's go ahead and turn off our depth for the background and turn on our subject. All right, so we already have our mask we put around our subject's layer, which we expanded a tiny bit, just so it covers everything, because if it doesn't cover everything, you can get some weird like shearing, like it'll split the edge that doesn't quite overlap the depth pass. Fill it with neutral gray to start. Background foreground colors are 50% gray and black, so we only ever add up to white. We're gonna make sure our opacity is set to 100% and 50% gray, so we should be able to drag our gradient tool from here to here, and then roughly along the plane where depth is going back for our subject, just to start, to get us some general depth. And we're gonna go ahead and add more detail to that depth. Starting with the shoe, just mask that off with a feathered elliptical marquee. Feathering in my case about 100 pixels. It depends on the resolution of your photograph though. So we're gonna add to this. I set it down, opacity down to 10%. That'll make the end of the toe brighter than the heel of the toe, so the foot looks like it's sliding forward a little bit. Actually, let's go ahead and grab the burn tool, burn the highlight range. 15% exposure is fine. Make sure hardness is 0 and you can increase the size. And then go ahead and burning those highlights down so the heel is less. And we can go ahead and use also the dodge tool for things that are closer, and make sure we're doing midtones. Probably about 10% is good, because you can always go over it multiple times. Make sure you have a large enough brush. So we can go in for things like the hand. You can go ahead and obviously that's sticking forward, so we're gonna keep dodging that up until it has more depth forward. And we'll hit up the pinky there, which is sticking forward. Hit up the ends of the fingers. because they're sticking forward. And do like the knee here, end of the toe here as well. Just kind of go in all those areas and kind of fill in where you kind of need more of that depth. Once we're happy with that, we're gonna go in now and overlay the original subject back on top of the depth map to add in kind of depth to those details that's not really there. Just very subtly though. So what we're gonna have to do is go ahead and Alt drag our subject and then set the mode to linear dodge, which is add. But now what we need to do is greatly reduce the contrast of this layer. Go ahead and first, of course, desaturate the layer, and then go adjustments, gamma correct or exposure, and then hit the gamma correction way down. This will flatten everything out while still keeping the details in there. Just your gamma correction all the way down and your exposure all the way down. So now we have this very flat. Once we flatten that out with exposure, go ahead and reset the layer to linear dodge add, because we're gonna want to see how this is affecting it. And right now it's still blowing it out, so go ahead and go to levels. Bring those levels down until we're kind of satisfied with the level of detail that's being added to it, and so it's not blowing out the foreground stuff completely either. The subtle detail makes a difference here. This face, these highlights on the face are a little too dramatic. Go ahead and blur those out a little bit. Once you're satisfied with it, how it's blending, go ahead and merge the layers. Now we have to help prevent any sort of clipping or weird stuff going on with alpha channels around the edges of the subject. We're gonna go ahead and add a layer below that. Just fill it with neutral gray, 50%. Merge those together for the depth subject, for depth for background. Go ahead and save. Important that you save, because next thing we're going to be doing is going to import this over in After Effects. Project open over here. You're going to go ahead and right click import file. Got it open in your Finder. You can just drag the file over and it'll automatically show up in here. And we want compositions. We don't want to retain the layer sizes because we want the compositions to be the full size, which they are, but just to ensure it so it doesn't get any weird offsetting with the composition, because the way the depth map works is it has to fill the entire thing. So merge layer styles into footage. We don't have any layer styles, but just merge them into the footage. And then make sure our composition settings are correct. Yep, that's all correct. And we can leave the resolution because we're gonna scale it after the fact. That way we won't lose any detail. Check out our stuff, turn off our depth layers because we don't need to see them. Select subject to start. Right click on the effects dialog box and go distort displacement map. And then we're gonna wanna change our settings on this to, first our displacement map layer should be depth subject, because it'll default to itself. And we want this to be luminance, because we made a luminance map. We have our horizontal displacement, which moves it from side to side, as you can see here, kind of gets a nice perspective effect. Then below that is our vertical displacement, which is what we're going to be using because we want to create a camera shot that moves down and away from our subject to give a sense that he's kind of drifting away from the camera on his angle of perspective. So you can see there we're adjusting it, but if you go too far, you start to notice it squishes it so much that it clips it out. So you're kind of limited in how far you can distort it, but copy this to our second layer, our background layer, because we also need to add our depth paths to our background. And we're going to animate them separately because you're going to be able to pull a lot more depth out of the more geometric background rather than the more organic subject. Displacement map to depth background for this one, obviously. And then we'll see that our displacement is moving the walls up and down as if it were actually moving in perspective, which is pretty nifty, if you ask me. Go ahead, and so we're gonna actually add a little parallax effect to this as well. So we're gonna go ahead, and I shot this on a 20mm on Super 35. That's gonna be close enough to get similar perspective. I would set these to 3D layers now. This won't affect the depth map because the depth map is being applied to the 2D aspect of the 3D layer. So it's not going to magically pop it out into 3D or anything like that. But we're going to combine the two to get a more three-dimensional effect. So go ahead and select the background layer, go to its position, we'll drag that back. You can adjust the distance based on how much you want that to parallax, because the less you separate them, the less they're going to parallax. Go ahead and set this, scale that back up so it fills the frame again. And go ahead and select our camera, because we can leave our subject where it is, because it's already on. By default, it'll be in the middle, in Z space, which is where our point of interest is on our camera, and we want it to stay on that. So you can go ahead and set keyframe for your camera at 0, and then we're gonna make this about a 5-second animation. So we're gonna go out to 5 seconds and set a keyframe there, so we get that nice parallax of the camera moving back. And then we also want to move our camera down and away from our subject, just so the camera kind of moves along the depth that's already there. So it looks less weird that way because you're not going to change the perspective as much as you would. It's going to be a little more natural looking. So now that that's set, let's go ahead and keyframe our position of our subject. We want him to look like he's drifting back as well. So we're going to send him in Z space back a little ways. Not too much, but enough. Once again, moving along his perspective axis. All right, so that's going on, cool. So now we're gonna add our displacement to this. Keyframe at 0, and we're at 5, and then displace down, so we're gonna be able to see, as we move down, you're gonna see the subject should scrunch up in perspective a little bit. So we're gonna get that subtle perspective change where his feet and legs and stuff more lay out in a flatter perspective. So he's kind of going, I guess, like this a little bit in perspective. You can kind of adjust how much we can do that. Roughly, I find you can get to around -30 to -40 or +40. -30 to +40 is about as much as you can get out of it before some like narrow things like fingers and stuff start to get all super flat and weird looking, which we don't want. All right, that's looking good. Now go to the beginning and now just send it the other way. So his perspective shifts the other direction. So you go from +38 to -36 at the beginning there. So he's flattening up as we do that. So we're gonna do the same thing to our background. We're gonna clearly see here that the perspective, we're gonna see more of the floor and the wall, lose a little bit of the wall. So our perspective shift has to, at the end, go up to, we probably don't wanna go much past here. As you can see, we can get a lot more out of this. We can get to over 100 without it looking too odd on the perspective shift. So we get that nice shift of the wall. It gives us a sensation of moving, falling down ourselves as he's falling backwards into the corridor, which I thought is a nice effect as well. And it's very spooky, moody, dark, like my heart. And I like the whole like floating shot. It's one of my favorites. Thank you, Eliel and Kristen, for helping get this picture like that. Getting a nice shift of perspective in there. So I want that motion to be like drifting back in a way as the camera moves down. So it's like, you feel like a good strong sense of separating from the subject in Z space. Because that's what makes stuff look cool. Z space. You don't want just a flat two-dimensional X and Y. Gotta have Z in there. Or Z for my British and Canadian friends. Z space. That actually sounds cooler, to be honest, than Z space. Z space. Now that we're happy with that, we're gonna add another layer of depth to this, or another layer of motion using the puppet tool. Let's go ahead up here and select the puppet pin and go ahead and we'll start putting pins at joints and extremities. So we start with an extremity and then we want it to bend here at the elbow as well as at the shoulder. So you kind of go through where the joints are, and those are where these pins will use to control the distortion on the subject. So go for like center of the palm and shoulder on this one because we don't want much bend in the elbow there because the arm's fully extended. Hit up the shoe and start at the heel there, and knee, hip. Cool. So now after doing that, you might also want to expand, so this prevents shearing on the edges, especially when we're doing these distorting effects. The distort is happening before the mesh is moving stuff around. So you can also get shearing of edges. So expanding it out a little bit doesn't hurt because it's already transparent and it's not going to affect the background. So go ahead and grab the starch tool now, and these would be where bones are. So this is where you don't want them to flex. So add a couple in between where you don't want any flexing to occur. Shin bone, foot is very typically stiff when it's in a shoe. All right, cool. Now what we've got to do is animate these points. We animate the yellow points. So go ahead to our selection tool. And since we started this at 5 seconds, we already have keyframes there at 5 seconds. So we need to add keyframes to the beginning. Close everything down and hit U twice. Hitting U twice pops up all our modifications and keyframes. So go ahead and select everything and click one of the keyframes at the beginning there, and you'll have keyframe at 0 and at 5 seconds, which is the duration of our animation. So now what we want to go in and do is select our individual points, and we'll start with the foot. We want to select the toe and heel together because we don't want those to animate separately, since a foot is a rigid object. Go ahead and have the foot drift up, kind of falling backwards, so we want those joints to become more extended. Same thing here, have it drift out. Just kind of like everything's kind of throwing back, the hands reaching more towards us. And you kind of get that nice drifting that gives it the character a lot more life as he drifts into the darkness forever. All right, so this is looking good. I like this motion, looks natural-ish. Go ahead and select all our layers here, and we're just gonna turn this into a looping animation after we pre-comp it. So we can keep all our stuff in that pre-comp. We'll call this falling 1. Oh, keyboard shortcut for pre-comping, Command-Shift-C. And for the Windows users, it's Control-Shift-C. As we all know, Apple is better. We'll go ahead and do our time remap on this. Go right-click on the layer, time remap. It'll create 2 keyframes, one at the beginning, one at the end. So our animation goes to 5. We're gonna copy our first keyframe, go to 5 seconds, set a keyframe there, go to 10 seconds, and then paste our keyframe to replace that last keyframe at 10 seconds. This way it'll create a loop going back, forth. You can also add eases to it, and that will help smooth everything out. I personally like eases. Well, we're gonna change our resolution. We're down to 4K because we don't need to use this entire image because this image is huge. So now we're gonna go ahead and add an adjustment layer, and then we're gonna add noise to that adjustment layer. Adding noise back in helps it look more like video, because video, the noise from frame to frame changes. So if we zoom in and look at either side, there we'll see that from frame to frame, there is a change between the pixels, and it looks unnatural. It doesn't look like video unless there's just a teeny tiny bit in there. So adding like 2% noise back in is enough to sell that. As an added bonus, I'm gonna show you quickly how to make an Anaglyph, a 3D version of this. And so you already have a depth map. Creating a 3D version of this is actually really simple. Go ahead and duplicate our pre-comp, falling 1, twice, and then we'll rename that, I guess, falling L for left and falling R for right. Because we need, for binocular vision, which we have, we need to create something 3-dimensional. We need to add a left and a right eye. Left and a right eye. Get that straight. Figure it out. Don't worry, if you get it backwards, there's a little checkbox in the 3D glasses effect. Go ahead and drag them into our falling 1 comp, those new created pre-comps. For the left eye, we're gonna bring this down to, we're gonna wanna see more of the left side of the subject. So we're gonna shift this negatively in the displacement. So to be in a more left side perspective, and usually I like to give a -20 about that for on horizontal displacement. So on the left side, everything should kind of look like it shifts a little towards the right. And for the right side, everything should shift a little towards the left, so we're seeing more of the right side of the subject, if that makes sense. So we'll go ahead and do that, 20 on each side so it's even. The split, so we have about a 40 split. Back into falling 1. And then we'll create a solid layer solid and add the effect 3D eyeglasses, which you can find under Effects, Perspective, 3D Glasses. You'll need a pair of these guys here to view it and really tweak it to get it to where you want it to be. So you can buy cheap versions, paper ones of these online for pretty inexpensive. Once we have our 3D glasses applied to that layer, we'll set our left view to falling L and our right view to falling R. And if we've done everything right, the perspective should be correct, and it looks like we have. Now we set that to balanced color red blue. Everything is in the proper depth, and you can kind of tweak around with scene convergence. Has to do with adjusting how far to left or right it's shifted, and that changes how much your eyes have to go in versus out. The more they have to go in, the stronger the effect gets, but the more it hurts your eyes, and it'll get to a point where it's painful, or your eyes just can't simply focus on that convergent point, or you'll have swung them too far out if you put them too negative, and that just doesn't work at all. The other thing you can adjust is the balance, which has to do with the balance color red-blue anaglyph. So it kind of leaves all the color looking natural, and you can kind of adjust how strong the red-blue is to a point where you can't see it when you have the glasses on. So go back to our main comp, and we'll see that's already cropped for our anaglyph. And just as an added thing, I'll go ahead and add a quick little punch to that, because heck, why not make it a little more dramatic? We want him to look like he's drifting to the darkness, just down a dark corridor. Maybe this is just me subconsciously creating a metaphor for my life. So I'll go ahead and render this out and enjoy. And we'll add a bit of creepy music because it's Halloween. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial of adding motion to a photograph. If you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell. I'll keep making these. Hopefully people will watch them. That's all I have for today, and I will catch you in the next video. Happy Halloween.